Hello, welcome to the final episode of our series of webinars on global challenges. I'm Dawisson Belém Lopes, along with my dear colleague and friend Aziz Saliba. We'll be moderating this final debate, and we will try to cover different topics about the Indian Ocean region today. It's a daunting task. It's a very challenging one. But for this, Aziz and I will rely on a very distinguished panel, actually a true team of stars, a spectacular group of both practitioners and academics who are Prerna Mukharya. She's the founder of Outline India. And the first time we met, I remember she told me she was a data evangelist. But I should tell you, she's much more than this. She is a Chevening Fellow at the University of Oxford. She has an MA in economics from Boston University. And she's kind of a celebrity in the corporate world, I should tell you guys. She's been listed one of those 40 under 40 by the Fortune magazine in India. And I'm so happy to have Prerna with us this morning, Brazil time. Thank you for joining us from Delhi, I suppose.
That is correct, Dawisson. Thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here and extremely happy to be part of this very erudite and very interesting panel. Thank you for including me, Dawisson and Aziz. Look forward.
Thank you, dear Prerna. There's also, and speaking of celebrities, Showkat Shafi, one of the most talented photographers of his generation. He's joining us from Doha, Qatar, where he serves as a senior photographer at the global headquarters of Al Jazeera. He's been around, he's seen the world, he's been to many different places on international assignments. Bhutan, Nepal, he's been to the US, Alaska, he's traveled all across the Indian subcontinent, and he's been to Brazil as well. He's a friend of UFMG, he's been twice to Minas Gerais. Such a pleasure to have you with us this morning, Showkat.
Thank you so much, Professor Dawisson, and thank you so much, Dr. Saliba, for having me today here. Thank you.
Another great participant, Aishath Rafiyya, a good friend from the Maldives. And whenever we meet, she keeps telling me, you should visit my country. So she serves as an informal ambassador of tourism in the Maldives. And I should let you know, Aishath, if I had the money, I would travel to your homeland. It's such a fantastic, terrific place, but it's so far off. I mean, it's so far away from Brazil. Besides being this promoter of the Maldives, she's a very well accomplished political leader. She's the founder of an NGO based in the Maldives, which is known by the acronym RAFI. It's the Regional Action for Fostering Youth. And she's also an executive director of a think tank in the UK, the Global Peace Institute, which I also serve as a fellow. So I'm so happy to have you with us this morning, Aishath. Thank you. And last but not least, my dearest colleague and friend, Guilherme Casarões, who is a professor of international relations at Getúlio Vargas Foundation. He's also served in different capacities. He's held different positions across the world. He's been an academic visitor at Tel Aviv University in Israel. He's also been a visiting scholar in the US at Brandeis University and Michigan University as well. What an honor to have you with us, Guilherme.
Thank you, Dawisson. It's my pleasure to be here.
And Aziz Saliba, the co-editor of the Global Challenges book series, he'll play the role of the discussant, and he always comes up with excellent, beautiful questions, always tailor-made questions for you guys. So you can just wait, and he will come up with nice questions for you. Okay, so you know the rules. Each one of you will be given 10 minutes to freely develop your points, your ideas. And when your time's up, I'll let you know gently, okay? You don't need to interrupt your interventions. And then when this first round comes to an end, we jump to the Q&A. We will be collecting questions from the audience as well. And Aziz and I will be conducting this second half, the second part of our event. So with no further delay, I should pass the floor to Ms. Prerna Mukharya for the first intervention.
Thank you, Professor Dawisson. And very happy to go in first. As a data person, I love to quote figures, and when I get to go first, I get to pull in all things that are very data-oriented and survey-oriented, because that's what I do, and I think that's the piece that I understand best. I understand today that we're here to discuss global challenges in and around the Indian Ocean, and I come from India. I live in New Delhi, and over the course of the next 8-9 minutes, I want to zoom in to quite an extent and talk about how India behaves, acts, and the kind of impact that this has, on the global south and economies across the world. We house about 1.3 billion people, and whether we vaccinate our people, how we react to the pandemic, has ripple effects across the world. Again, when it comes to the IT sector, a lot of companies, a lot of countries are dependent on us. A lot of cheap labor does come from India. So from that context, today I want to touch upon vaccines. I want to touch about loss to learning outcomes. I want to touch upon briefly livelihoods and women and gender and digital divide. I want to dial back a little bit, maybe to somewhere around 2020, and around April to June 2020, they estimate that India's GDP fell by about 24.4%, and give it another 3 months, we fell by another 7%. And as per some initial estimates that economists have managed to concoct, we're saying that India has more than doubled the number of people falling into abject poverty over the last year. Now, these are extremely disturbing figures, and we've come up with these figures without having a complete hold over the extent of the problem. The pandemic is far from over. In the second wave from sometime last year, and this wave was very personal to me, sitting here in New Delhi. The degrees of separation closed in. We lost people, not friends of friends, but we lost people within our own family. We lost friends. And again, if you were to quantify losses to the economy, I think about 10 million jobs were lost in perhaps a time period of 2 months. Again, they estimated that if we were to go into another lockdown, the loss to GDP would be 1.5 to 2%. So there's this big debate happening within and the Indian subcontinent, and more specifically in India, about how does India fight the pandemic? Do we exercise curbs as they see fit? And then again, much like a lot of developing countries, much like Brazil perhaps, politics, governance, bureaucracy comes in, right? So the pandemic gave rise to what we perhaps are now calling the black market economy, specific to the pandemic, wherein drugs such as remdesivir perhaps sold for 1,000% higher markup, right? And it sent the entire space into a dizzy. Now, weak public infrastructure is not something new to this part of the world. It's certainly not something new to India. But it kind of highlighted how perhaps we've not been focusing on the 2 pillars of a developing country, which are health and education, and how much more focus is perhaps needed for a country such as India to be more responsible. Again, if I get into numbers, about a month and a half ago, they say that only about 10% of the entire world was vaccinated as of June 21st. And from these 10%, it was largely the developing countries that were vaccinated. Across developing countries, the number was as low as 0.9%, right? So how does in India, where only 5% of our total population has been vaccinated, how do we deal with a force such as COVID-19? How do we protect our people while protecting their jobs, while protecting their incomes? And I think the common, the common thing that everybody is saying is, if we stay home, we're perhaps safe from the pandemic, but if we don't step out, we don't have food to eat. So how do you deal with a paradox such as this? And then, at the other end, we've seen these big sporting events. We've seen the UK host the Euro Cup. We've seen Wimbledon at play. And in fact, there have been some papers and some conversations around how perhaps the spread of Delta variant in and around the UK is in a fair way affected by the fact that these sporting events led to large congregations of people, many or some of whom were perhaps not vaccinated. So how does the world deal with COVID-19 when so many decisions must be made, whether it's about money, whether it's about revenues, whether it's about lives? In the Indian context, though, other than sporting events, we have the equivalent to sporting events in India, which we like to call religious congregations. So sometime around Jan to March, we had what we call the Coup, wherein millions of Indians gathered together to bathe in the holy river of Ganges. And there was a lot of chatter around how people showed up without COVID certificates, without COVID negative tests. And perhaps this played a very big role in the second wave coming about. The second reason is, again, what everybody's calling vote bank politics. We had large rallies, unmasked, uncounted, numerous people who gathered together to show support for one politician to another. And a lot of these conversations, a lot of these cases have gone to the court about how does one value changing the government at the state level vis-a-vis protecting the lives of innocent people. But anyway, if you were to, again, try and figure out how many jabs does India need on a daily basis, they're saying we're vaccinating about 4 million people a day, but we actually need to get into somewhere in the range of 8 to 9 million jabs a day. Now, if you look at some European countries, that's the size of a whole country if you look at a small country. So, in that way, if we are managing to touch upon 4 million jabs a day, that's actually not too bad in spite of our very weak public infrastructure. But then that takes us again to, the superset of India, which perhaps lives in rural India. There's very few of us who live in the cities. About 65 to 70% of India still lives in its villages. Only about 50% of India actually uses the internet. And within those 50% active users, within those 50% internet users, you only have 25% who are active users. And if you drill down further, the proportion of people, the gender proportion, a large part of that 25% is all men. So there's very, very, very few women who are actually using the internet, using Wi-Fi, or accessing the internet on their smartphones. In fact, a majority of women still hold, these simple Java phones that can cost you anything between $25 to $50. Of course, now smartphones are becoming easily accessible. They're fairly cheap. We have a lot of Chinese smartphones coming into India, but in rural India, smartphones are still counted as a household asset, and it's typically the lead male member who kind of hangs on to it and uses it to access whatever kind of information they want to access. So when we talk about vaccines, are we really not talking about women who are as is at a disadvantage when we talk about a developing country such as India? And when I talk about India, I'm perhaps even talking about a country such as Bangladesh, which is right next door. Maybe I'm even talking about a Nepal or a Bhutan in some way. The other repercussion or correlation that I should perhaps talk about is women who perhaps are non-literate, women belonging to lower SECs or lower socioeconomic categories. If they are illiterate, they're not really accessing the right information online. If they're not accessing the right information online, they perhaps don't have enough money to have the right phones. And that might in turn imply that they're part of the informal economy in a big way. And a lot of these jobs within the informal economy do not enforce labor laws. So while you and I working in the companies that we do work in, our employer might either ensure that we are vaccinated in a big way, or they might encourage us to go get vaccinated, or they might organize a vaccination drive at the office. That's typically not what happens for a lot of these women who in a big way suffered in the first wave, in the second wave of the pandemic, and we don't know to what extent their misery will last. I think I also now want to maybe just touch upon some of the other numbers. They say that there's about 58% of women in India who never use the internet in comparison to 38% men. Just think about what this means. There's 58% of this country, women in India, never use the internet, right? So when we have these debates, when we have these conversations, what does that really mean in terms of equity, equality, even within the country? And I'm not even talking about the Indian subcontinent. How we sort of made vaccines available in and around India is by accessing this app.
Just a second, I can barely hear you. There's something going on with the audio. Maybe we should try again. Okay, I think we can resume. Let's see what happens. It's failing.
Is this okay?
Oh yeah, now it works. Wonderful. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, I think some key went off. I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Okay, all right,
Go
all
ahead.
right. Okay, all right, yeah. I think I was just talking about how 50% of women in India have never really used the internet and what that kind of means for accessing vaccines when it's all through an app that has to be on your phone. If you can't really read or write, if you don't really have a smartphone, are we really creating a fair ecosystem? What about vaccine hesitancy when there is so much misinformation? Women aren't sure about who to go to. If you live in rural areas, it's really your spouse or the male lead member who has that phone. So what happens to the superset of India? What happens to about all these women constituting about 44% of the Indian populace who don't even really go online, right? Maybe I now want to just briefly touch upon women in jobs and what has changed in the last 2 years. UN Women says that for every 118 women in abject poverty, there's about 100 men in abject poverty. So there's a big disparity when we talk about poverty in itself. And as per certain figures from the last year, they say that of all the jobs that were lost in the first quarter of 2020-2021, 8 out of 10 jobs were lost by women. And these are women who are largely from the informal sector. They work as health, they work in the services country. And if they had a male employer, he was more likely to let go of a female employee if he had limited resources than a male employee, right? So whereas is looking at a disadvantaged gender, but the pandemic has perhaps brought down the numbers for women participating in the workforce, which stood at a meager 16%, sometime last year. Just to try and close out this conversation, again, I think that the solution to any developing country doing a little bit better, or the solution to any developing country trying to tackle a problem of this scale is education and health. And I've talked about health. I just want to briefly touch upon education. There's a big debate happening in the subcontinent about opening up schools even if children aren't vaccinated, even if a meager 5% of India stands vaccinated, simply because the loss to learning outcomes will be so huge if we keep our children out of schools. Our children haven't been in schools for about 16 months, barring the very top creamy layer. Majority of kids aren't really accessing any content online. What we're saying is that if there are phones at the household level, these children of migrant laborers or these children whose parents are farmers, if they have a smartphone, they can perhaps access some information online. But then a lot of these areas have intermittent access to internet, if at all, or maybe there's multiple kids within the household. So how are all of them going to access information online? India's in fact received some $500 million from ADB to try and combat loss to learning outcomes. But I think we have a long road ahead in terms of recovery. And in fact, for these very reasons, I am also a proponent of our children going back to schools. I do hope that India, for the purposes of saving lives, does find middle ground when it comes to vaccines, but also finds a way to ensure that these children don't permanently drop out of schools for good. Thank you. Thank you.
Great account of of how life is in India at the moment. And interestingly enough, I mean, India is bound to become the most populous country in the world anytime soon, and the third largest economy in the world as well. So what happens to India matters to the whole of the world and is by definition a global challenge. So I thank you, Prerna, for this very fresh, vivid, and interesting, no pun intended, very nice description and analysis of India. Now I pass the floor to Showkat Shafi, who, if I'm not mistaken, who will approach some topics in Central Asia. Am I right?
Yes. Thank you to Dr. Saliba, and thank you, Professor Dawisson, for inviting me here today. And I'm really happy to be here today. And today, like as in South Asia and other parts of the world, we have this coronavirus is going on. But in South Asia and Central Asia, we have another big problem, which is Taliban 2.0, their developments in Afghanistan from last 2 months. I would like to talk about it today. So from this year, the US has decided they will pull out all the troops on 11th of September, which is exactly 20 years from 9/11. And that thing prompted Taliban to take over to the cities and the villages in Afghanistan. And today, as yesterday on 9th of August, Taliban declared they have taken over to new 6 cities in Afghanistan. So if we see in just 1 month, according to Taliban, they took over 85% of Afghanistan. And it is a big worry for South Asia, for India, and for the world as well. And right now, as we speak, it's like 3:30 p.m. in Doha. There is a high-level meeting happening right now in Qatar between a Taliban delegation and this US envoy on Afghanistan, Zamle Khalilzad. He arrived in Qatar today morning for a 3-day meeting with Taliban. They are going to press Taliban not to take over other cities like Kabul. There is just a few cities now which are not in control of Taliban, according to the Taliban. So this problem, it is not only Afghanistan's problem. If Taliban will take over to Afghanistan, it will be problem for entire South Asia, Central Asia, and it will have some global impacts as well. Interestingly, this Taliban 2.0 is a different Taliban. It is not as it was seen earlier. This time they are on 28th of July, a high-level Taliban delegation led by Mullah Baradar. He is one of the important figures in Taliban. He went to China and there was a warm welcome for that delegation. And you can see here, like China is inviting a Taliban delegation. And it is really, really interesting here to see like China is going to give them support because US is leaving. Earlier, it was only US who was involved in in Afghanistan. Now it is China who is getting involved in this. And that is going to be a big problem for India and other South Asian countries. So, and interestingly, Taliban has given an interview to South China Morning Post that they are not going to interfere. They are not going to let anyone use Afghanistan for the attacks on China. And we will never, ever say anything about Uyghur Muslim issue in China. It is China's internal policy. And that is very interesting here, that Taliban is saying Uyghur Muslim issue in China is China's internal policy, which is same language used by Pakistan as well. And all other countries like US, European Union, India, they have always said, like, they have always spoken about the concerns, what is happening against the Uyghur Muslims in China. So right now we have to see this thing. This is very interesting here, that this is not same Taliban, which was there in 1996. It is 2021 Taliban, it is Taliban 2.0. So they are not going to isolate Afghanistan. They are already like, they haven't taken control over full of Afghanistan yet, but they are planning to make it like, they are already making their diplomatic relations with other countries. So for India, it is going to be really bad. It is not only like India has over $3 billion projects going on in Afghanistan right now. And till now, India has been always good supporter of Afghan governments. But what if Taliban takes over? So that is a big challenge for Indian government. And if we believe some sources, Indian officials have already started meeting Taliban representatives in different countries. So because it is really important for India to be like to be in good relations, whoever takes over Afghanistan. So it's not like as we are like right now we are talking from last 4 days. Taliban have taken over 6 cities in Afghanistan in 4 days. And the government officials in Afghanistan have also confirmed it. And this is going to be one of the biggest crises in South Asia in next few months or few years. It depends on for how long the Taliban, for how long the Afghanistan government forces can hold Taliban out of Kabul. And this thing from last 2 months, there have been thousands of people who have fled their villages and cities. And there is this interesting point what Taliban did from these months. They took control of the borders between the countries like Tajikistan, Iran, Pakistan, Turkmenistan. So it is the people who they used to cross over to Pakistan, the internally displaced people, they used to cross over to Pakistan or to Iran. But Taliban has already sealed those borders. So there is a big crisis right now inside Afghanistan. IDPs, internally displaced people have become like every day thousands and thousands of people are flooding from one village to another and from one city to another. And it is going to be a big challenge for near future in our region. And its effects won't be only in South Asia, it will be seen in Middle East and Central Asia as well, and to some extent globally as well. And but yesterday, US they have declared they will definitely pull out all the troops there. But Afghanistan government right now, they are requesting them to keep the troops there, but like they are not. They are like they have decided they will take the troops out. So it is going to be like people around the globe should watch this space. Like this is one of the biggest challenges we have in South Asia. And it's not the only thing. I would like to talk about one more problem here. In your one of earlier discussions about Southeast Asia, one of the participants asked a question about Myanmar. That is one of another problems we have right now. So in Feb this year, there was a military coup in Myanmar, and the civilian government, they were all arrested and put in the jail. More than 900 people have been killed since February in Myanmar. And right now, and thousands of people, opposition people, have been jailed in Myanmar. And that is going to be that Myanmar problem is not only the Myanmar's problem. A long civil war in Myanmar threats the regional stability and will need to be addressed by regional powers like India and China. And this Myanmar, the problem in Myanmar is not only, it is another bigger problem for India, because India is bordering Myanmar. When the problem started in February, thousands and thousands of people fled from Myanmar and they entered the northeastern states of India. So why I discuss these two, because these are like, we are talking about Indian Ocean today, and India has these two big challenges in near future, both Myanmar and Afghanistan. And India have invested more than $3 billion, as I earlier said, in Afghanistan, in like road projects, at building airports. So India won't let it go as like easily. So it is going to be a bigger challenge for South Asia in the near future. So those are my 2 points for the South Asia from here.
Thank you very much, Showkat Shafi. Very, very nice intervention, as a matter of fact. This one has a transnational nature, right? You have focused on 2 regional crises and all that they entail in terms of an uncontrolled flow of migrants and all disruptive effects. So I really appreciate this effort to try to connect Central Asia and Southeast Asia to the Indian subcontinent. It was really nice to hear you. And now I pass the floor to my friend Aishath Rafiyya for 10 minutes. So please. We can't hear you.
Okay.
Now we do.
Okay, it's nice to be here, and thank you so much, Professor Dawisson and Dr. Saliba, to invite me here. And I think that the international community has been very slow in coming to the realization over the decades that the current political and economic order is not the best that we could have been. Like, say, it has failed in the interests of its power, like, say, the power struggle from the ordinary people to the elites. And this is also a huge drawback of our times. Like, when we talk about the challenges and the global, like globalization, I think the majority of the big powers continue to be obsessed with the national securities, and also significant small countries like us thinking in terms of the human security. So I think there is a Cold War, like, has been won by the India-US as opposed to the China, Russia, and Pakistan. I'm not sure whether everyone would be agree with me, but I think that this has come to a level also with the pandemic. So much of security in terms of economy, in terms of human drawbacks, in terms of human security to the countries as small like the Maldives, and also to many South Asian countries. And in terms of Maldives, first I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic and the economy, the economy has drained so much. As you all know, that tourism is the major backbone of the country. And with the lockdowns, continuous lockdowns, and the border closure of Maldives as well as the foreign countries, I think we have come to a level that the country could barely give salaries. They have been, the budgets have been reevaluated. We have been taking loans, and we are almost like in a point where, the debts are so much than even there would be, even the smallest infant could bear, but then slowly it's been picking up. I think the tourism has flourished once we open more borders. I think it will be getting better and better. And so currently, I think we have, if I'm not mistaken, we have almost 5,000 or over 5,000 arrivals per day right now to the international airport, which is a fairly good amount considering the last 2 years that we have been struggling. And talking about this, I think when we talk about the global issues, the politics, the climate and vulnerability is something that we need to discuss about. And Maldives is a low-lying country. We have a lot of lots of issues, lots of challenges in terms of climate and in terms of the globalization and global warming. So many problems are foreseen, and I think the government has taken really nice steps. This year, we have banned plastic bags that's been used, one-time plastic bags, and so many other smaller plastic bottles, and so many imports of plastics have been banned. So, which is a good but a radical measure, I think, followed with the pandemic. And also, when we talk about the globalization and the global issues, I think democratization is something that we need to discuss about. And concerning the ordinary people, as Prerna, my colleague, has just said, that women and children, young people, when we talk about that, I think the politics, what we have right now in the Maldives, of course, we are fighting for democracy, and all the leaders, like including everyone would be saying this is an infant. We are in the infant stage of democracy. So many things to come. Always good will be getting. But I think how many years do we need in this infancy? It's been 12 years or more that we have been, democracy has come, and then the people has, the new, we have enacted the new laws, constitutions, but something that things doesn't come into reality is the women that we always talk about. Women is half the population, but the problem is women are not given the power to exercise their rights. So with the politics and this hostility, political polarization, this has become a very favorable ground for the corruption. Young people becoming more detached with the public, becoming more hostile. It's a ground for hostility, a ground for terrorism, a ground for radicalization, and a ground that, the activists of radical activists or, terrorist activists can use. So this has become like more dangerous in the recent years. And when we talk about the justice and tackling this corruption issue, this was one of the prime promises of the current president when he came to the power, and with his first public speech, he clearly said that justice would be given. And the blogger Yamin Rashid, Afrashim Ali, and also the disappeared journalist Rilwan. So these are unidentified bodies, and still, this needs to be done. Still, this needs to be. Nobody have identified Yamin Rashid's, Rilwan's body. Nobody has identified the death of Yamin, or we couldn't find the perpetrators, exact perpetrator behind Afrashim Ali's murder. And identifying the reforms of judicial independence was something that the president's highest priority. But until today, we have not seen this, except putting their favorite people in the judiciary system, which is also an alarming thing as far as I see this. Right? So, women and the rights, when we talk about it, we have a long way to go. It's not about Maldives, but in South Asia, in Asia, and also in a lot of European countries as well. And here we do not have, women's workforces, women in workforce is only just 21%. And talking about this, women in C-suite jobs are so less. Women, when we talk about women and rights, the single mothers, the widows lining up all in front of the courts, wanting to get the rights of their children, begging money from the fathers. Fathers are supposed to put some amount of money for the, years for the children. But, this is not happening. And the courts have failed and failed. The leaders have failed big time for these things. So when we talk about the democracy, global justice, and, justice for all, I think it's, the justice for a normal human citizen. This is one thing that is important. And when we talk about global challenges, I think that these are the challenges that we want to, we want to be resolved. Talking about this is like, even if you talk about the, boy who wants fresh water, someone who is in a very urban area who needs fresh air to breathe, someone who is, begging for money to even to go to school, decent school. So these are human basic rights. So if the human basic right, like, see, these are part of the, human rights, the right to live. But, when we talk about bigger issues, I think the smaller issues are not tackled, and it's like not with all the smaller states, but we are with the smaller states, but these are the interferences, and because of these interferences, I see that lots of young people from South Asian countries, from Asian countries, and the professionals, they're leaving our shores, most load on the search for economic security abroad. So they are moving to European countries, they're moving to Middle East, and these are not just board people, not just the heads, but these are among the science graduates, they are among the professionals, law graduates, and these are needed personnel for our growth. And it's so I think once we are left with just to rest, I think we will realize that we have the South Asia has a brain drain. So this is very much on this. So it's time to concentrate. I think the leaders, the political leaders should concentrate on the income, wealth, injustice, and also the realization of the wealth, the distribution, equal amounts of wealth distribution. So I think that these has to come. We need more political leaders to come forefront with the will, with the political will to resolve these issues. It's not about that every day we talk about this, but things are just lying down in the files and in the recs, So we need more people to go to the ground level, talk to the grassroots, see what's going on, rather than just sitting up in the, AC rooms and, covering up their shit. I'm so sorry about this slang, but I think this is what is happening. So in South Asia, we need more political leaders who uphold the moral values and talk about to do things that they preach. So they should practice what they preach, walk the talks, but we don't see this. It's just big shows and empty promises. And the thing is, how long are we going to stay with this? How long are we going to, the public, the normal people, how long are we going to, suffer, tolerate this? And when we talk about this, I think when someone comes and talk about this, no tolerance. But, how can you explain the tolerance of these young people who are normal citizens in South Asia? Thank you.
I thank you so much for providing us with such a depiction of your country, very rich in depth. And it really struck me as a surprise that there's so much resemblance with my own country, to some degree, of course, but I mean, the Maldives is a small country. Brazil is a big one in terms of population, territory, but the problems are just about the same, young democracies, the status of women and institutional problems. I mean, we are on the same page. I should now invite my dear colleague, Casarões, Professor Casarões, to have the floor.
Professor Lopes, Professor Saliba, all the panelists, thank you so much for sharing this moment with me. I'm very happy, very thrilled to be here. As we speak, troops and tanks are marching around the Congress in Brazil, so that's something to worry about, at least a little bit. But the focus of today's conversation is not really Brazil, even though I can underline also many similarities with situations from the other side of the world. But my idea for today's presentation is to share with you some thoughts about Israel and the role that Israel has in the larger Indian Ocean zone. That's the purpose of the volume organized by Professor Lopes and Professor Saliba. So that was my task when he invited me to write something about the Indian Ocean, I said, well, let's think about the Middle East, and can I speak about Israel? And then he said, sure. Israel has been one of my fields of specialization for the last 15 years. I currently do a lot more research on Brazil's foreign policy than Israel proper, but I've dedicated some of my time as a researcher to talk about Israel. So that's the reason why I wrote this piece for the volume, and that's why I'm proposing a conversation which is called very provocatively A View from Israel, because obviously Israel has a very biased way to see the surroundings and the rest of the world. So I'll try to figure out why has Israel behaved the way it has behaved in the last 2 decades, and what are the impacts, the global impacts of Israel's bigger behavior. So in a nutshell, this is the perspective that I want to propose. How is Israel positioning itself in the world, and the larger impacts of those positions? First of all, let me start with an overview on Israel's foreign policy strategy. I mean, in very, very simple terms. If you look back into the sources of Israel's foreign policy, we identify some common traits, some commonalities across time. And those commonalities might be reduced to 3 very simple terms. The first one is Zionism. So Israel, first of all, wants to be recognized as a nation state for the Jewish people. It seems to be, to me, that this is innegotiable as far as I'm concerned. So even though left and right in Israel try to frame this problem in slightly different terms, that has been a cornerstone of Israel's presence in the world for reasons that we understand, even though those reasons, they have caused a lot of trouble with the neighbors as well. The second element of Israel's foreign policy, and that has been also very persistent across time, is security. So Israel wants to preserve its borders. Borders in Israel, as you know, are very much disputed. But Israel wants to preserve its borders. And most of all, Israel wants to be considered a normal state by neighboring countries. He wants to be recognized diplomatically so everyone understands and accepts the current boundaries of Israel in the Middle East. And finally, development. Israel, more so than ever, wants to position itself as a military technological power. And to get there, it relies a lot on innovation, on technology, and that's pretty much what Israel has been all about for the last 20 years, the so-called startup nation. We might disagree with those terms, but this is how Israel has been trying to promote itself publicly in the last few years. And to get there, Israel has adopted a series of strategies. So if we could sum up the strategies of Israel foreign policy, especially in the last 20 years, I would also get to 3 terms. The first one, ideological alliances, which means reaching out to states, parties, and religious groups in order to undermine any international resistance against normalization. So Israel has a strategy of, for example, reaching out to evangelicals in the United States to lobby for Israel, reaching out to evangelicals or to Jews in some parts of the world to create this pro-Israel lobby, very strong, by the way, across the world, and especially in the Western world. The second strategy is the strategy of containment. So Israel, and then again, this coincides with the beginning of the 21st century. It has tried to check existential enemies of all kinds, Iran, Palestinians, proxies like Hamas or Hezbollah. And of course, it does so by joining forces with some regional and global partners. I'm going to be a little bit more specific about this in a minute. And finally, economic cooperation. So Israel understands that technology interdependence is a path towards normalization. So even towards countries Israel had little to no relationship with, such as India or China, Israel has been trying to create some defense interdependency so that they can at least recognize each other and deal with each other in a more normal way, so to speak. From the early 20th century up until 2009, Israel had 2 prime ministers, Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert. They were both very important in the construction of Israel's foreign policy strategy in the wake of the 21st century, so to speak. And they have faced very specific challenges during their times in office. Just as a summary, Ariel Sharon was the man who, in many ways, provoked the second intifada that started in late 2000, early 2001. And he was elected prime minister as a response, as a reaction of society to the beginning of the intifada. And he had to deal for most of his time in office with domestic terrorism, not only provoked by Palestinians, but also provoked by the greater militarization of relations with Palestinians as well. He was the man who pulled out settlers and troops from Gaza in 2005. He suffered great domestic opposition, but there was an attempt at normalizing relations with the world by giving up on Gaza, so to speak. So that was a very important move, but at the same time, it backfired because Hamas took over Gaza a few years later. And of course, Ariel Sharon was also marked by failed attempts at resetting negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. Now, his successor, Ehud Olmert, Sharon fell sick and he died a few years later. So Ehud Olmert was his replacement, and he became first as an interim prime minister and then as a full-fledged prime minister from 2006 to 2009. He had to face a lot of challenges as well. The Second Lebanese War, frustrated peace talks with the Palestinians, mediated by the United States, both at Annapolis and the Sharm el-Sheikh, a growing inter-Palestinian division, and of course, the Hamas takeover of Gaza was a very important moment along the way. And finally, he finished his term in office in early 2009 with the war on Gaza, the first war between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, let me focus now on the government I wrote about for the book, which is the long government of Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is important because this man, he has remained in office for 12 years. And this is a very impressive track record for an Israeli prime minister. He's been able to survive in office for many different elections and coalitions. And this is what I've analyzed in the book. Benjamin Netanyahu has changed and adapted Israel's foreign policy strategies to suit his own political needs. So in many ways, for his very long time in office, foreign policy equaled domestic politics. So there was no clear distinction between both. You can argue, of course, that has been true for Israel ever since the beginning of the country. But at the same time, I think that here we saw the exaltation of this process of creating a foreign policy strategy that was totally connected to the base. In the silver lining to connect both things was what we call revisionist Zionism. So he used foreign policy to advance a century-old doctrine, which is more than just Zionism, more than just the recognition of Israel as a country for the Jews. It's a recognition of Israel as a total country for the Jews, which includes the Palestinian territories. So that was the point that he tried to advance for most of his time in office. And of course, as a populist, he has mobilized populist strategies to galvanize support at home and abroad, as a good old populist that we know. So he kept dividing the Israeli society and the world between friends and enemies. He kept playing off to his own supporting base, sometimes in very consequential ways. And of course, one of the elements of populism and of populist style, so to speak, is the permanent creation of crises, threats, and breakdowns. So he had to foster a permanent sense of fear and of hatred among Israelis so as to justify most of his expansionist and revisionist policies for his time in office. And as to his main foreign policy strategies, there are two big categories. The first one was the proposal of eliminating existential threats, so fighting sometimes with brute force, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, in confrontation with adversaries. So he antagonized presidents like Barack Obama, the European Union, even the Palestinian Authority or the PLO. So he treated them as adversaries and treated Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas as existential threats. But both categories are very antithetical to good diplomacy, right? So Israel has pretty much created a world in which pretty much everyone around it is either an enemy or an existential threat. And of course, as a consequence, Israel has sabotaged every Palestinian demand at the United Nations for recognition. It has wholesale delegitimized multilateralism altogether for most of its time in office. There were two major wars on Gaza in 2012 and 2014, one of which has created a diplomatic crisis with Brazil in 2014, with high civilian death tolls and public criticism of Israel's disproportionate use of force. And the second strategy of Netanyahu was to break with Israel's diplomatic isolation.
Just
so
Netanyahu, 10 minutes, okay?
So Netanyahu has made a permanent bid for normalization. How did he do it? And that's the core of my point here. He has turned to non-Western powers such as India, Russia, China, and some Gulf countries as a source of power and legitimacy. And at the same time, Netanyahu has very shrewdly constructed transnational alliances with far-right governments, Bolsonaro, Trump, Orban of Hungary, and evangelical and Jewish communities all over the world. So as a conclusion, in the 2 decades into the 21st century, Israel has maintained its basic foreign policy drivers, Zionism, security, and development, but with a twist. Let's say with a higher tone, to put it this way. At the same time, especially during the first decade of the 21st century, developments during and after the Second Intifada, such as the security or apartheid wall, the expansion of settlements, further militarization of relations with Palestinians, have led to unprecedented diplomatic isolation of Israel. How has Netanyahu tried to solve this problem? He, as the longest-serving Israeli prime minister, has conducted a successful foreign policy strategy from, of course, his own standpoint towards normalization. Revisionist Zionism has kept supporting, his support base closer together. That's how he has survived for so long in office, even with a lot of corruption charges. By getting closer to non-Western powers, as India and China, he has increased Israel's military clout. And finally, by getting closer to Iran's enemies in the Middle East, such as Qatar, but especially the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Israel has hollowed out negotiations with the Palestinian Authority because the most important pillar of Palestinian resistance was still support among the Arabs and across the Arab world. And that has been undermined recurringly under Benjamin Netanyahu. And of course, those are challenges for the new government that has just taken office, and which is rather bizarre from a political standpoint. So we expect this government not to touch upon the foreign policy issues that Netanyahu has crystallized somehow. Thank you very much.
Great presentation, and actually a great set of presentations. Very nice overlap. And I find that this group has done a good job so far in, interestingly, in bringing to the table the situations in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, in the Maldives, a small island in the Pacific Ocean, and the Middle East. You guys have provided us with a very broad picture, which is really nice, really commendable. So I thank you for this. And now the first hour is behind us, and I invite Professor Saliba to start the second hour of our debate. So please, Professor Saliba, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It was, first of all, it's always a pleasure to be with Dawisson in any of the initiatives that we have, the many initiatives that we have had together. So Dawisson, thank you very much for working with me in this collection and in these panels. It has been a pleasure for me to participate in the organization of the book, and also in this very sophisticated panels that we have had over the last months. this is the last but not the least, right? This is an excellent panel. So I would like to thank the panelists that we have here today, Prerna, Showkat, Aisha, and Guilherme, for their excellent presentations. They all, I mean, I have many questions to pose, but I'll have to restrain myself for the sake of time. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Guilherme, Prerna, and Showkat for their excellent contributions to the collection. So it was a pleasure to read your texts. I do have a few questions here. Some are in reaction to things you said, other regards issues that I perceive as relevant for this specific area. So I want you to feel free to share your views on any of the issues that I will raise, and also to ignore any of the questions that I will pose, right? There's one specific question here, which I will address to one panelist, but you can also feel free to comment on it if you want. So first of all, both China and India have raised their standing in the international arena. If you take economy, population, size, possession of nuclear weapons, technology, among other criteria, China and India already are or soon will be in the top 5 of a world ranking. However, Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar noted that 2020 left the China-India relationship, I will use his own words, profoundly disturbed. In addition to border issues, India's relation with Pakistan deteriorated. Pakistan has become an important partner of China, and here there is perhaps an enemy of my friend issue. The revision undertaken by India of the constitutional status of Jammu and Kashmir, including territories contested by China and Pakistan, also played a role in worsening Sino-Indian relations. And as Showkat mentioned, India and China are on opposite sides in the Afghanistan civil war. India has invested significantly in the current government of Afghanistan. Showkat mentioned the $3 billion figure, whereas China has been more, Pakistan and China have been more supportive of Taliban. So I would like to ask you to address the present, and with the help of your psychic powers, the future of Sino-Indian relations. The other question, as I heard, I remember very well the chapter written by Guilherme, and as I heard him, the question that occurred to me was that at first, the Bolsonaro government gave the impression that there would be a much better relation with the US. After Trump's defeat, however, it was clear that the better relation was with Trump, not with the US. And another friend of Bolsonaro, real or imagined, I will not get into this discussion here, but another friend of Bolsonaro was Netanyahu. And Bolsonaro even pledged to move the embassy to Jerusalem, a promise that he has not so far fulfilled. With Naftali Bennett, what should we expect from the Bolsonaro government? Additionally, how do you see the relationship between the Bolsonaro government and Mood in the Mood government, not in the Moody's government? Finally, I would like to say that one of the greatest threats to politics and even personal relations is fake news. In the last election in Brazil, social networks played a significant role, and quite often not a positive one, by serving to spread false information. Some measures have been taken here and elsewhere, but the efficacy of these measures is still unclear. In some cases, it seems that new venues have been found to replace older ones. For example, here in Brazil, Telegram has experienced considerable growth. And a study from UFMG, the university to which Professor Lopes, my good friend Dawisson, and I are affiliated, found that over 90% of the groups support one political candidate and frequently resort to inaccurate or misleading information. So I'm interested in hearing your views from all members of the panel about the role of social networks in India and elsewhere, and finally, ideas on how to fight fake news. Again, I would like to thank all of you for your excellent presentations, and I'm looking forward to hearing your views on these and on many other issues. Thank you very much, my friend Dawisson.
I told you beforehand he would come up with hard questions. Huh? I will invite Prerna to face them. It's all on you.
Thank you, Professor Dawisson. So, thank you for that very difficult and very tricky question to answer as an Indian citizen, Dr. Saliba. I'm going to try and answer a part of that question when it comes to India, China, diplomacy, and focus more about what India wants the world to perceive of it as. And I'm going to leave the whole territory part and foreign policy part and Kashmir part to Showkat to answer. I know he feels very passionately about the subject based on some discussions that we had a few years ago. So I will concede that piece and give it completely to Showkat to answer. I think in the last couple of years, Dr. Saliba, especially since Modi came to power, and he's been in power, he's in his second term, and we're seeing a lot of conversation already around what election 2023 will look like, and we're seeing Modi's team setting up for big announcements to make in 2023. And there's a lot of chatter about India. If Modi visits the UK, it's all over the news. Modi's visiting people at Google, and there are these big speeches around Indian CEOs who are now working for these big conglomerates. So India's worked very strategically, very hard to highlight some of these triumphs in the last 5-6 years, and rightfully so, right? We are no more that cricket team that, when pitched against India or Australia, there are racist slurs and Indians don't react, right? So you have to talk about cricket when you talk about India. Right now, when you have the English cricket team or when you have the Australian cricket team, there's as many slurs on both sides, right? So there's aggression on both sides. And of course, a big part of the Modi campaign was also about, taking pride in who you are, right? And for the longest time, we saw within India, not feeling as comfortable or thinking that speaking in Hindi is not so cool, right? But he's promoted the idea of Make in India to be this cool thing. He's trying to get the younger generation to latch on to some of these variables, and in a big way, it has worked. Of course, with that image has come regionalism. With that whole triumph of promoting what being an Indian means. There's been chatter around what Hinduism means, and what that might mean for the Muslim community. And for the longest time, the one thing that everybody did think of India as, and again, I'm not talking about Kashmir, Showkat, but we thought we are very secular. We want to believe that we are very tolerant. But this is again a very internal joke in India, that in principle we're a calm nation. In principle, we don't like going to war. But nature's not been so kind. Look at the kind of neighbors we have. We have Pakistan right there. We have China around the corner. Afghanistan's not too far. And then on the other side, you have Bangladesh and all the refugees that come with it, right? So politically incorrect statement, but that's how a lot of policy circles think when you're out for drinks in the evening, right? So these are some of the internal conversations in a light-hearted manner, right? But again, coming back to what's really happening on the ground and the image of Prime Minister Modi, I think everything was going just fine, but even that image has taken a big hit in the last 6 months. A lot of people are not very happy present day with everything that transpired in how the government dealt with the second wave and all the political rallies that were encouraged, and a lot of lives that were lost. So a lot of Modi proponents, a lot of current government proponents are also not so sure about how they feel about the current government. But again, if I'm to go back to research and if I'm to go back to statistics, which I like to do, public has short-term memories, right? And a lot of research has been done that will how the present government dealt with the pandemic affect results in 2023, and there is strong evidence to suggest that it won't, right? So you tend to forget things, right? Now we're again eyeing a third wave. We don't know if it's going to come around or not, but what's the highlight in today's news is how the Indian Prime Minister presided over a very high-level UN meeting, right? So we are trying to project this image of, listen, we're the largest vaccine producer in the world. We are vaccinating more people than any of you can ever think of. So while it's very easy for you to turn around and say, listen, it's just about 5-10% of your population's vaccinated, we still want to project that image. Listen, we're out there, we're standing tall, and we're dealing with it the best we can, right? Look at your own numbers, something like that, right? So there's this whole pride that comes with being an Indian now, right? And there's this whole projection that comes with being an Indian now. So that's one. The second thing is, again, you will not see this in international news quite a bit about, of course, there were some images that were put out about the number of lives that were lost, or how the pandemic destroyed livelihoods and the impact on, some of the poorer people that are the superset of India. But those stories do fizzle away, Dr. Saliba. Those are not stories with Turkey burning or, with other such international pieces of news. Again, public wants to see whatever's projected more. And of course, the independence of media in India is circumspect present day. But again, I'm going to reserve my comments on that topic as well, right? So there's much to be seen. I'm just going to close this off by, again, when you look up India now, you'll see a lot of chatter or news items around, Indian edtech startups that have raised billions of dollars, that are edtech startups more specifically. But like I said, right, it's only about 20% of or 25% of your population that's online, and those two use the internet intermittently. So if you drill down, we're talking about a very small subset of the Indian population. But because this is the population that's online, they kind of take center stage, or the limelight is always on them, and your perception will change, right? Hearing is believing, right? Seeing is believing. So if you see and if you hear so much about these specific subsets, you want to believe that, hey, India is so cool, so many edtech startups, you and UN meeting. They are the largest vaccine producers. They must be doing fine. So, you have to look at all of this maybe with a pinch of salt. That's about it from my end. Thank you.
Yeah, very nice takes. Very nice takes.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Shafi.
As Prerna said, Dr. Saliba asked a tricky question. I remember my last trip to Brazil. He asked very tricky questions that day as well. I know he's an expert of tricky questions, and it is exactly same. Okay, let's talk about India and China. So in history, we have seen there was only one war which was fought between India and China, and that was in 1962. And in that war, India lost China. But after that, there has never been a war between India and China. So as far as I am concerned, I don't think India and China are going to go for a war anytime soon. But the fight in June 2020, which happened in Galwan Valley, which is part of Jammu and Kashmir, where I come from, it is so they fought. There was these confrontations, and they had a fight between the soldiers of India and soldiers of China, and it was fought with sticks and stones, not guns. The fight was in 2020, and it was not fought with the guns. So you can, like, it can be anything, like it was not a war. It was not war situation, but it was so bad. There were many Indian soldiers who died. India accepted like some soldiers died, but China didn't release the numbers. They said, oh, no, nobody died from our side. But there were reports, there were some people, some soldiers who died from Chinese side as well. So, and this kind of confrontation happened after, like, it happened before in 1975. And after 1975, it happened again in 20. So I think these kind of things will happen between India and China, not only in Jammu and Kashmir area, but in Northeast, where Sikkim, where there is another border between India and China. These confrontations here and there will happen in future as well. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't think there will be a war between India and China anytime soon. And as you already mentioned, the Pakistan part. So there comes the another part here as well. So enemy of an enemy is my friend. That is also true. So there is sometimes confrontations with Pakistani soldiers from Indian side, again in Jammu and Kashmir, again on the border. But I don't see any war coming anytime soon, other than the war which is happening right now across the border in Afghanistan. That is the biggest war. That is the biggest challenge right now in South Asia. And I think whatever happened in June 2020 between the Chinese troops and Indian troops, it won't repeat. So yeah, I would like to stop here. Yeah, that's what I feel.
Dr. Rafiyya, would you like to react to some of Dr. Aziz tricky Saliba's comments?
It's really tricky, and I think we are in between Showkat and Prerna. Yeah. Of course, I have to also put down on some of my comments, especially towards the right wing of how Modi used the right wing of India to destroy Muslim community, which was so harmonious. I mean, like, they have a very homogeneous culture blended together with Muslims and other parts of India, right? So keep it down, keep it aside. India is very friendly with Modis. And interestingly, it has been always very friendly, and the friendship becomes more depending on who is in the power. So right now we have very good friends. India and Maldives is very friendly. But I'm very surprised that the number of people in the Indian embassy, in front of Indian embassy, who is a big queue, asking for Indian visas. I'm not sure why is that. The government to government is really, really friendly, nurturing each other, commenting, petting on the shoulders, but the normal citizen, who are begging in front of Indian embassies to get a normal visa to go to India for medical treatment. So this is how it has been. I mean, like, I don't know how to explain these politics, but I'm telling that maybe in my politics, maybe I'm kind of, you know, because I am not a supporter or pro-supporter of Nasheed or the present regime of the Maldives, yeah? But I'm a very balanced person. But talking about this, you know, when we talk about this, I think, and also the global issues of the, you know, terrorism and stuff. These days we don't use guns. These days we just make people go blind. These days we just make people go so poor, you know, so poor that they die. And these days they make the country so poor that they become debt, you know, so much of debt. So India's politics towards us is like this. When we borrowed funds from the China, India as our big brother has helped us really good, yeah. And then, you know, the interesting thing is India wanted to borrow funds from China, adopt some values of interest, give it to Maldives because we are poor. This is the politics that's, you know, we are behind. We are not Pakistan, we are not India, we are just in between. But the best issue is India has been always very close to Maldives, unlike other, you know, countries in South Asia. I don't know why the interest, you know. But I think, you know, commenting down my stuff, I think we have a very big interest here. And talking about the fake news, since the beginning of Maldives, we have been, you know, having a 30 years regime, and people were like, you know, like from the very beginning, people were really silent. I mean, like we don't have that kind of freedom of speech and stuff. But then once the President Nasheed was in the picture, and there was a few times that he was in front of the media saying that even a fake news, even which is a lie, when you say it in this number of times for this number of days, people will believe that, you know, it's true. So this has been a norm since the past 12, 13 years, and recent, you know, political rallies and also recent elections, what they have used was the President Yamin is corrupt. President Yamin is, you know, is a thief. So this thief is like, you know, it's going on. This is also one of the misleading informations. And when the list came, half of them was the president, I mean, like the present government's, you know, people in the power. So it's not only about the Yamin or his corruption or you know, it's nothing. And you know, the interesting thing is the next one. I mean, the opposition will always use when you know, it's the current political party. PPM will always say to MDP that these are seculars. So in a Muslim country, these are seculars. So it's like, this is also one news going on. So it's like thief, forgery, and corruption and seculars, you know, versus this. And then this versus against people. So these are things that people have used. But I think as responsible citizens, we have to find ways of, you know, checking these bubbles, the fake news bubbles, shrink, you know, how to shrink these, flag these. And now I think nowadays Facebook has a really nice way of flagging these issues. And sometimes when you post something, they have even they have a checker as well, right? Online checker to flag this fake news. Also, we need to you know, fact check. I think these are things that we can do as you know, people in the media, as well as people who are in political forefront, or people in as academics. And also we have to stop the spread. And there, I really can't understand how we can do it when the political leaders use this to nurture themselves, or to feel good, or to feel to make the, you know, normal citizens feeling good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Guilherme, your turn.
Very tough questions. Thank you so much, Aziz, for the questions, by the way. Let me just start kind of off the topic. The growing militarization of both India and China are awesome from an Israeli perspective, because Israel keeps building greater ties, greater interdependence ties on defense and technology with those countries. Of course, no country alone is able to sustain Israel's growing military industry. But at the same time, the more Israel diversifies its portfolio, to put it this way, with countries as diverse as Brazil and India and China and South Africa, it's interesting for Israel on its path towards normalization. So the cases of both China and India are very eloquent, because both countries back in the 1980s recognized Palestine as a country. Back in 1988, when Yasser Arafat, by the way, declared the independence of Palestine in 1988 before the United Nations General Assembly, both China and India said, we are totally pro-Palestine. This situation has very slowly changed. And of course, I'm not even talking about the Arab countries, but I'm talking about the big players who could have played the role as emerging powers in mediating new rounds of negotiation between Palestinians and Israelis. And this has not happened. This is interesting because as early as 2010, when Lula was the president of Brazil, we really thought emerging powers, represented by the BRICS, for example, would engage in constructive peace talks in the Middle East. You guys remember that Lula went to Tehran and brokered an agreement with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad at the time and Erdogan of Turkey. And it was the same year Lula went to Israel and Palestine as well to try and get closer to both countries. So I really thought, as an analyst, that we would be seeing, as we enter the second decade of the 21st century, a coalition of emerging players trying to make a difference in the Middle East. And how do you make a difference in the Middle East if not by mediating talks between Palestinians and Israelis? And this hasn't happened. Maybe because Israel has been so successful in forging this defense and technology interdependence so as to neutralize any greater criticisms on Israel's policies towards the Palestinians. And of course, there is a very interesting relationship, a very curious and complex relationship between Modi and Israel, because, well, they are very different. I mean, both Netanyahu and Modi have their own domestic agendas, but they share something in common, which is the growing animosity towards Islamic terrorism. And that's how they like to frame it. So the same relationship Israel has had with Hamas for the last, 35 years, Modi has towards some Islamic groups in Kashmir. So this whole policy of taking off the autonomy of Kashmir, of alienating Muslims in India, I think it converses somehow with how Israel has been dealing with its own Muslims for quite a long time. So birds of a feather, right? So they have a lot in common in terms of their populist strategies, in terms of their far-right ideologies, and of course, they are both anti-Muslims. Now, taking a step back, Aziz has asked me about Bolsonaro and how the Bolsonaro government deals with all those challenges as well. That's a very interesting question. Bolsonaro, he has made a massive strategic mistake, among many others, but this strategic mistake was particularly problematic. He built ties with people, not with countries. So rather than fostering a good relationship with the United States, he decided to foster a good relationship with Donald Trump. And the same with Israel, right? He got closer to Benjamin Netanyahu at some point. And in both cases, Trump and Netanyahu, Bolsonaro did something that is against, and Aziz, I know that you're very knowledgeable about this. It's against good diplomacy, period, because you do not support, you do not root for one side of a democratic election. If you're a foreign leader, you don't do this. I mean, it's bad diplomacy altogether. So what Bolsonaro did was to support Trump vocally, repeatedly, over 2 years. And he has support. You guys have to remember, Bolsonaro went to Israel in March 2019, and that was like 2 weeks or 1 week before the national elections in Israel. And when he got there, Netanyahu was so excited. He was thrilled because he was expecting Bolsonaro to announce the Brazilian move of the embassy to Jerusalem. And Bolsonaro, of course, because of his own domestic reasons, couldn't do it at the time. But there was a frustration that reveals something beyond that, which is Bolsonaro went to Israel to campaign for Netanyahu 1 week before the elections. I mean, this is not something that countries generally do. So by meddling with people, not with governments or states, Bolsonaro has alienated any possibility of true friendship or greater support on the part of whoever came to succeed those two leaders. That is true for Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden doesn't want to have a good relationship with Bolsonaro. Of course, he's trying to maintain some state-state relations on a very diplomatic and high level, because Brazil, after all, is a very important and strategic country to the United States. But at the same time, I mean, Biden personally doesn't want to mess with, this proto-dictator that some people consider Bolsonaro to be. And at the same time, Naftali Bennett, although he's a right-winger in his own behalf, right? I mean, he is a far-right politician, but you have to understand the nature of the new Israeli coalition. It's a mess because you have from the far right to some members of the center left, you have Meretz, which is a leftist party in Israel, and all the centrist and radical religious parties, even an Islamic party in the middle. So the reason why they needed to form such a strange coalition that in Portuguese we call geringonça sometimes is because they needed to defeat Netanyahu. And Netanyahu seems unstoppable, right, from a political standpoint. I mean, he still got the majority of seats in the Knesset, but they had to turn around him, and that's how he could do it. But because of this, I don't expect much of foreign policy from this cabinet, from this coalition. Because if there's something that differentiates the same members of the coalition is foreign policies, how to deal with the Palestinians, how to deal with the notion of greater territorial Israel. And because of this, and I borrowed this expression from Dawisson, because of this cacophony within the government, we don't expect much in terms of foreign policy. So that's why I think, that's my personal opinion, they are going to push foreign policy to the sidelines, at least for the first year, at least before things really settle. And as a consequence, number one, you don't expect a return of conversation with Palestinians, first thing. And second thing, you don't expect much from, those loose and kind of feeble partners of Israel across the world. That you don't expect Israel to look to Brazil and say, okay, let's become friends all over again. I mean, that's not something that Israel is worried about right now. So my impression is they don't care about Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro has been an obstacle for this coalition to exist in the first place. So let's leave Brazil aside for a minute. Evangelicals, to be sure, are still very important. But not as a consistent partner. Now, finally, and that's my last word in it, how to strengthen the fight on fake news on social media. And my answer is very simple. More democracy, more freedom of speech, more freedom of press, and more engagement of civil society. How do we get to that? I don't know. If you watch Netflix series, How to Become a Tyrant, we understand that one of the first topics of the playbook of any dictator to be is to suppress civil society and freedom of speech. So they know that they have the hegemony. But I think that especially in democratic societies, we can try to stimulate more and more participation. That's what I teach my students every day. And I hope it makes a difference. I think it's still far away for Brazil to get into a full-fledged dictatorship, but still we have to sow the seeds of contestation from now on to make sure that one day, if it happens, fake news are not going to prevail.
Great takes. 4 excellent participations in a row. And there's time for one final round, so I'll leave you with a few questions now. For Prerna, my dear friend Prerna Mukharya, there are many questions from the audience, as a matter of fact. So people want to know, first, what's your assessment of Modi's handling of the pandemic in India? Another question on anti-vaccine movement. Is there such thing in India? And thirdly, there's another question for you on Modi's diplomacy towards China. I think maybe this question has already been dealt with, but I mean, you can amuse yourself with the questions I have just posed. Showkat, for you, what's the place of China after the withdrawal of American troops in Afghanistan? So what role do you see for China in the future Afghanistan? And secondly, a question by Fernanda Carvalho. What do you mean by the new Taliban, and how different is this new version from the old one? For you, Aisha, you have mentioned that the Maldivian young people, they are fleeing the country. And I found it very interesting and enticing, because I remember in the past, and when I was in India, for instance, I remember listening to some people who would take this phenomenon against a very positive light, in a very positive way. And they would refer to, given the Indian diaspora, which is huge, they would call it brain gain rather than brain drain. So wouldn't you apply the same kind of benevolent look to the situation in the Maldives? Is it even possible? This is my question. And lastly, for you, my dear friend Casarões, India's foreign minister, Jay Shankar, has referred to India's policy towards the Persian Gulf and Israel as, and here I quote him, the expanded neighborhood policy. Does it make any sense after the departure of Israel's prime minister, my God, Netanyahu's departure? Does it still hold true for India? I mean, this expanded neighborhood policy, do you think it's even, I mean, an applicable idea for the years to come, given that Netanyahu is now gone? So yes, we have 5 minutes for each one of you. And I start with Ms. Mukharya.
Thank you for that, Professor Dawisson. So I'm going to try and answer the question about the Prime Minister's handling of the pandemic and the vaccine movement. I'll try and answer both of these together. So, you know, there are these small steps that I feel a government can take that can go a long way in terms of trying to fix a situation, avoiding a crisis, or ensuring that people stay calm. And I think the Indian government's been good with that. So in the last 16 months of the pandemic, you cannot make a phone call to anybody without listening to a whole spiel about, but that lasts about a minute. So there's this voice that comes on to any phone call you make to anybody that says, listen, stay indoors. This is the helpline number, right? So it's a very small step, but I think for a lot of people who are perhaps not as educated, don't know much about resources, I think this whole simple phone call thing, you know, has been helpful. So small steps taken by the government. The second thing is, I think last year, sometime around last year when the pandemic broke out, the Indian government took very difficult steps. And I think Modi and his close aide were instrumental in taking this very, very difficult step of putting India into a tough lockdown where everybody was indoors. The last time India put something like this together was emergency, which is, obviously considered in a very negative light for obvious reasons, but taking that blunt, tough decision of shutting down offices, shutting down schools, no flights, nothing, restricting movement, and restricting movement in a very big way, doesn't matter who you are, etc. Was a tough step, and I want to believe that at least since I've been around, since I've been a grown-up, or as far as my memory goes in the last 30 years, I wouldn't know of another prime minister who would have been able to make a decision as difficult as this, as intense as this, that have, in spite of the opposition, in spite of what that might do to the vote bank. But this is a decision that was taken, and I think that's one of the reasons why, the world over, at least last year or October, November, there was a lot of praise about how India, in spite of its numbers, did so well. So in India, social distancing is a myth, right? I mean, there's so many of us. You can't not take the metro. You can't not take a shared auto. You can't, maintain 6 feet of a distance. That's not something that we Indians understand. We're a close-knit people. We don't like the idea of wearing masks, but a lot of stiff measures were put into place. So I think I have a lot of appreciation for the Indian government. I want to recount a personal instance. So I contracted COVID-19 last year, sometime in October first week, and of course, I belong to perhaps a specific subset of the society. So I had a room. I obviously was not in touch with anybody, but I want to tell this to everybody. So I received about 2 to 3 phone. So once I told, you have to submit, or you have to inform the authorities if you've tested positive. In fact, when you go get a COVID test done, it connects with your identity card, which in India is called the Aadhaar card. And then the information reaches the central ministry, and then you start receiving phone calls. While I was indoors, stuck in a room, I received about 2 to 3 phone calls on a daily basis from the government public health center, asking me if I was doing okay, asking me if I had isolated, asking me if I needed any vitamins delivered to me for free. And I received about, like I said, 2 to 3 phone calls for an extended time period of 10 to 12 days. Now, putting something like that in motion in a country such as India with 1.3 billion people is insane, is so difficult. And at that point, they didn't know I was an educated individual. They didn't know what my income was. So I want to believe that such steps and measures were taken irrespective of the demographic or the income bracket or the tax filings, all of that, because, and I think I have a lot of appreciation for those reasons. My initial 10 minutes, I did criticize the app in itself for, its digital divide and not being accessible to women. But again, I know for a fact, being slightly connected with policy circles, that this contact tracing app, was put into effect within, a week, 10 days. And again, I'm going to go ahead and say for a government, a government is a large body, and these are, there's a lot of inertia. There's too many moving pieces. There's too many ministries. There's too many bureaucrats, right? But for such a big body, a walrus, to move and put something like this into action, in a very short period of time. And again, I'm not going to get into how good that app is and, how effective that contact tracing is, but just for the government to put something like this into action, and for it to largely work, I think is, I'm going to have a lot of appreciation for it. Another point is, the first time I got my first COVID jab was this year, and I actually went to a public health center, and again, the jab was for free, and I was pretty impressed. And it was, a tattered room, but I was pretty impressed with the 3 individuals who were sitting there, who were giving vaccines to people. There was social distancing, and it worked like, like a Ford factory, right? You give your identity card, you move on to the next person, they ask you some information, third person, boom, and you're out. And this is, public health center that's probably handling hundreds and thousands of people, and it's probably some school teacher or some healthcare worker who's, paid very little amount of money. But again, and for this data, for millions of people on a daily basis to get aggregated and for all of this to come into effect, I think is pretty impressive, and probably a problem that not a lot of other countries can fathom. because you're looking at individuals who may not have phones, who are probably not carrying phones, whose phone numbers change. So for all of this data to connect to my identity card, et cetera, is pretty impressive. That's one. But I think, I must comment that this year, given how, political rallies were encouraged and certain religious congregations were encouraged, I think there's blood on the hands, and I'm not going to get into names or point fingers at blood on the hands of who, but I think there was a lot of criticism around the subject. And I think there has been a big realization, which is why we're again seeing the government tiptoeing around the matter. And I think like I said, we're currently standing at 4 million jabs a day, which in itself is a big feat, but we need to get to about 8 to 9 million jabs a day to be able to vaccinate the eligible population. So that's one. I'm just now trying to, close off with the China question. I think around last year, when we saw some issues around the Pangong Lake, around the same time, India received around $4.5 billion from the Chinese central bank to fight the pandemic, right? So, I mean, whether it's politics, whether it's optics, a lot of this happened alongside. And then, in the last week, there have been news about how there has been complete disengagement from China around the lake. And this is a lake, 2/3 of which was lost to China around the war, but there's been complete disengagement. And in fact, the Indian government just made an announcement today, an official announcement, that there has been no infiltration around these borders in all of 2021, right? So, there's going to be no war, but, we've taken a massive loan from this country, right? So everything we look at, all the news we hear of, I just try to caution the audience at all points to look at it in a very wholesome way. And, when you look at policy, there's no one right or wrong. It's always a gray area. So, make an informed decision based on all the variables that are around you. Thank you.
Very diplomatic, my dear friend, Prerna Mukharya. I like the way you see things happening, unfolding in your country. Very nice takes. My dear friend, Showkat Shafi.
Okay, so the first question is China's role in Afghanistan. As US is withdrawing its forces and it's leaving a security vacuum, there is someone who has to come in. So in this case, it is China. As I earlier said, on 28th of July, the top officials of China met a delegation led by top officials from Taliban, 9 members team. They met in China. It gave legitimacy to the Taliban government, to form a government in Afghanistan. So Chinese role, and as I mentioned earlier in my first 10 minutes, that China, they gave an interview and they said, Taliban gave an interview to a newspaper in China, and they said that we are not going to interfere in the internal matters of China, which is the Uyghur Muslims matter. And that is a big thing here. And it clearly tells us that China is going to invest in Afghanistan in near future once the US withdraws from Afghanistan. So the present government, which is right now, which is like a democratically elected government in Afghanistan, is supported by US, but US is withdrawing, and as per the speed Taliban is taking over to their borders, the cities, the villages in Afghanistan, one day it will fall to the hands of Taliban. And and that time Taliban needs some support, and it will be definitely China, So China will be another, after US withdraws from Afghanistan, it will be China which will be taking the shots in Afghanistan, particularly in the infrastructure, development, infrastructure and other things. It will be China. So I'm not sure about militarily if there will be some Chinese forces in Afghanistan. I'm not sure about that, but definitely for the development, Taliban needs someone, and it will be definitely China. So, and the second question from our audience, what I mean by Taliban 2.0, how is it different from 1996 Taliban? So right now, what Taliban is claiming that we will keep the schools open, the girls will be allowed to go to school. So if there are like women doctors, women teachers, they will be allowed to go to office, they will be allowed to go to hospitals. So that way, if we believe Taliban, this is exactly what they are claiming right now. And right now, they are trying to make a legitimate government in Afghanistan. And they will definitely have good diplomatic relations with some of its neighbors. And definitely, I'm sure, like not with US, but definitely with Russia and China and some other countries. And time will tell us what countries will support the Taliban government in Afghanistan. But right now, as we can see, China has clearly, publicly legitimatized the Taliban government in Afghanistan. They have shown their support for the government of Taliban in Afghanistan. So that's why this is definitely Taliban 2.0. It is not the earlier Taliban. That's what I mean.
Excellent. Very, very informative and sharp, on point. And now, Rafiyya.
Thank you. So coming to the brain game, the brain drain. I think talking about, look into what Prerna was talking about regarding the pandemic and how this, our leaders have dealt with it. I think I have a lot of appreciation as well. And also there are so much of commendable praises to the current president, how he dealt with it, how they opened the borders so quickly and all, even though it has to go again shut down. But still, it was really good. And for me, as one, I received my first dose on 7th of February and the second one on 8th of April. So it's been a while. So I think the government has very steadily done it, and they were so efficient, and as the tracing apps and registration apps and the vaccines and how the messages came and reaching people. Even though we have a very small population, but reaching is a very big challenge because of the geographically how the islands are, being there, and also the resort islands. So many, young people were in the resorts, working in the resorts. They've been isolated, and also they were currently in the island itself. So, it wasn't an easy task, but this was handled really well. Then talking about the brain game, the brain dead. I think it's not about Maldives, but it's about South Asia. People like, so many professionals from India, so many professionals like Showkat, from, Pakistan, Maldives, even Sri Lanka. I think, even Bangladesh. I mean, like when you talk about Bangladesh, how many experts are here in the Maldives? So, I think this is they have their own reasons for it. So when the country doesn't give them what they deserve, they have they always look for the better options. But when South Asia is kept without professionals, so what would be happening? I mean, this is a question, because at the end of the day, you talk about the nuclear weapons, you talk about the, the bombs, the blasts, all these kind of weapons, and then rest of the thing, when you really calm down and see how the situation in the country, though there is no war, we have domestic affairs left with us, children and the women. and sometimes no professional has to lead the country. So I mean, this is something which is even worse than a warfare, I think.
Excellent. Thank you for your honest account. And Guilherme, your turn.
I'm very, very happy to hear your thoughts about those issues regarding the Indian Ocean area, and especially because not being a specialist in any Asian country or far East Asian country, Southern East Asian country, I'm learning a lot from everything that you're saying, and I don't really understand why there are so many questions about India and Israel. Probably because that's a more and more important relationship. But I wouldn't look at this relationship as one of far-right ideology. This is a way many people have tried to frame it. I mean, Modi and Netanyahu as like two far-right leaders trying to work together. But I don't think this really solves the equation of India-Israel relations. So to refer specifically to your question, Dawisson, India's foreign policy towards the Gulf will remain there, irrespective of the next prime minister. I mean, I think that India has a very peculiar and sort of narrow position in Asia, because it has like a great power right on top of it, which is China. It has Pakistan on the other side, kind of checking any attempts of India looking furthermore into Central Asia. So the Indian Ocean Rim turns out to be the natural space of India's foreign policy, of India's ever more ambitious foreign policy. And of course, and there are the Bhutan, the BBIN countries, right? Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh. But if you look at the Indian Ocean Rim, I see two very clear regions of the world which have remained unexplored by the great power game, which are the East Africa coast, so Tanzania, Kenya, some parts of the Horn of Africa. So this is a place Russians are not really interested in. China is, of course, interested in, but for different reasons, maybe more in the southernmost parts of East Africa. So India has a place to work there. And of course, the Middle East. The Middle East is a place for infinite ambitions for all great powers. So there's room for everyone to join in and to be friends with. So I think that's the place India is trying to focus on, especially because somehow it even checks Chinese expansion in that region. It kind of rivals with the Belt and Road in Iran. And so India has been trying to get closer to those parts of the world. And Israel, of course, is a very important piece of the puzzle, because there are similarities between India and Israel that they cannot overlook, such as both are very close allies of the United States. And this is strategic. Both are fighting Islamic terrorism according to their own narrative. So that's also a point in hand. And both are trying to expand their own economic and political interests towards the Gulf region. So another good thing that they can work together. So I don't see Netanyahu as such a crucial variable if we want to understand India-Israel's relations. I think that there is a power in a long-term national interest driving force that guides India's foreign policy towards the Middle East, because that's indeed its expanded neighborhood. So the more India grows, the more natural it is to go to this part of the world. And at the same time, I think that Israel's relations with the Gulf and with India are built on very pragmatic basis. It has nothing to do with revisionist Zionism of Benjamin Netanyahu. It has to do with Israel's need to normalize its relationship with the world. And by normalize, I mean to establish good relationships, good diplomacy on diplomatic grounds. Unfortunately, there is a very clear loser in this game, which is the Palestinian cause. Because the more Israel normalizes its relations with the world, India, Gulf, the less leverage Palestinians will have to say, well, world, please help me to solve this problem altogether. This is probably not going to happen in the next few years. And this is unfortunate because I'm very pro-Palestinian in the sense that I really stand up for its cause, but at the same time, pragmatically speaking, I realize that the negotiation that everyone was expecting is far from taking place.
Excellent, very comprehensive approach, and I thank you for this. And I totally agree with you in the place of the Persian Gulf for Israel's foreign policy. I mean, whomever has already taken a plane between the two zones in the Persian Gulf and South Asia will be struck by the massive presence of South Asian citizens inside the planes. I mean, there's a lot of mobility, and I was really impressed and marveled when I first realized this connection, which was kind of alien to me as a Brazilian citizen. I wasn't really aware of this massive mobility, at least before the pandemic. I don't know how it is at the moment. As we approach the closing of this session, I now invite my dear friend Aziz to give his final words.
Thank you very much, Dawisson. And well, this is the last panel that we have. So Dawisson and I have been responsible for the international affairs of UFMG for over 3 years now. It has been quite a journey, and this task was one of the most relevant contributions we will be able to leave, and I think that the result owes much to Dawisson's hard work and perfectionism, as well as the contributions of many of our friends. I want once again to thank Dawisson and to thank every member of this panel, Prerna, Guilherme, Showkat, and Aishath, for their excellent presentations, for sharing your views with us and with many people here in Brazil and elsewhere. And I really hope to either see you again in person in the near future, here in Brazil, or perhaps in another destination worldwide. I'll be very glad to meet you once again and to be able to talk about local and international issues. Thank you for your excellent contributions, and I look forward to seeing you again. And I wish you and all members of the audience who have been with us health.
Thank you very much. A big round of applause to each one of you. Thank you, guys. Look forward to meeting you again. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.